All right, let's get started. Tonight we're going to talk about the use of the Old Testament and how the New Testament authors are doing that. If you have the reading from G.K. Beale, which you probably don't have as a book, it's not that book, but it was on the canvas as a handout.
And I think I left mine. This one.
Yes, that one.
This one. You said G.K. Beale?
Yes, handbook on the New Testament use of the Old Testament.
Okay, I'll find
It's
It was under your.
it. Yeah. Oh man, I didn't look. I thought I had looked and I didn't look. Oh shoot. I'm trying to figure what page it was. I marked it this time.
yeah, page 42.
Okay.
Yeah, when you get it, pull up page 42.
Yeah.
G.K. Beale has done a lot of good work on use of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And this is a very handy handbook. In this chapter, he lays out the method that he proposes. And if you see it on page 42 and 43, he has 9 steps. So the first step is what? If you want to analyze the Old Testament, the use of the Old Testament and the New Testament, what's the first thing you have to do? Yeah, you have to identify where you have an Old Testament reference.
Is it D.A. Carson and Beale? Is Beale by himself?
Just Beale by himself.
Got it.
Yeah.
I had him straight.
All right.
Either I'm missing something, or I'm not finding it. I did not see it.
Go to the week 9.
In the course, something I'm looking How you was going into trouble finding this stuff? I don't have trouble finding this stuff. Thank you.
Okay,
What page?
page 42. Mm-hmm. So the first step is to identify the Old Testament reference. And if you can, then qualify whether it's a quotation, which are often preceded by, as it is written, and then it's very clear that you're getting an actual quotation. Or whether it's an allusion, or kind of further down the spectrum, an echo. And then kind of beyond that, you got just the use of biblical language, not kind of referencing any specific passage so much as just using language that has been shaped by a lifetime of reading the Bible. Okay? Secondly, it suggests that you analyze the broad New Testament context where the Old Testament reference occurs. Okay, so you want to know what's going on in the New Testament passage, because then you can look for parallels to what's going on in the Old Testament context, which is the next step. Okay? And he suggests that you analyze the Old Testament context both broadly, so kind of where are we in the book, where is this book in the history of Israel, kind of thing, and immediately, so what's going on in the immediate passage from which the quotation or allusion is taken. Especially thoroughly interpreting the paragraph in which the quotation or allusion occurs. So, for example, in Matthew's temptation account, okay, Jesus has been in the wilderness for 40 days and nights. He gets a bit peckish, and so the devil shows up and says what? Yes, if you are the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. And do you know what Jesus says in response? Right. Do you know where that's from? Nope. It's not from Exodus. Keep going.
Deuteronomy?
It is Deuteronomy.
Because I know it's part of law and commandments. I mean,
Yes. Yes. So it is from Deuteronomy. In fact, all three of Jesus' responses come from Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy 6 and Deuteronomy 8. What is Israel's situation in Deuteronomy?
Well, let's see. They're getting the laws before they go into Canaan.
Yeah, they're on the edge of the wilderness, about to cross into their promised land. And Moses sits them down and says, okay, we're about to enter in, so let me remind you of everything God has taught us over the past 40 years. Okay? So you don't forget once we go in. Where is Jesus? Where? Hmm? Well, in the New Testament, in the Matthew passage, where is Jesus when he's being taken? He's in the wilderness. Yeah. You've internalized Dr. Dora well. He's not there.
I know she talks about you too. She said, keep it.
Right? So where is he in the New Testament? In the Matthew passage. He's in the wilderness. Where? At the very end, after 40 days and 40 nights, getting ready to enter into his promised land, his ministry. Right? So why is he quoting from Deuteronomy? Well, he's in a parallel situation to where Israel was, which suggests that what Israel was doing and receiving at that point in time is probably relevant to what he's going to be facing. And it turns out that it is. Okay? So do you see how you kind of look at the broader context of each and see, what kind of parallels you can draw to see why it might be appropriate to draw from this particular book or passage? Okay? Now, Beale goes on. The fourth step is to survey the use of the Old Testament text in early and late Judaism that might be of relevance to the New Testament appropriation of the Old Testament text. So what he's saying here is you look at kind of how this Old Testament passage has been used in the intertestamental time up, into contemporary Judaism of Jesus' day. This is a step you'll probably want to go to commentaries for. You're probably not going to take the time to survey, all the intertestamental literature to find where you might have references to your passage. But you want to know, because they could be interacting not with the original text so much as with current interpretations of it. Okay, and so you want to know how the text was being used, if it was being used, commonly or whatnot in the day. All right. Then he says, point 5, you want to compare the texts, including their textual variants. Okay, so you have the New Testament. You have the Septuagint. What is the Septuagint? Yeah, the Greek translation of the Old Testament text of the Hebrew, and it's abbreviated LXX. You have the Masoretic text, which is what? The MT. Masoretic text is the Hebrew version of the Old Testament. Okay, the Masoretes were the ones who went through and pointed it, and yeah. So the particular version of the Old Testament that gets used for translation and all that is called the Masoretic text. Potentially, it's the official one that gets used. And then he mentions the Targums. Targums were the Aramaic translations of the scripture that you would get in synagogue services. Early Jewish citations in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Pseudepigrapha, Josephus, and Philo. Okay, and he suggests that you color code the various differences. Okay, so you want to know how these texts differ. Okay, is the Septuagint different than the Masoretic text? Is Paul's citation different from the Septuagint or different from the Hebrew? And what does he seem to be? Does he seem to be quoting the Septuagint, or does he seem to be translating directly from the Hebrew? These are the kind of questions you want to ask. Okay? Then he says, analyze the author's textual use of the Old Testament. So which text is he relying on? Is he making his own translation? How does this bear on the interpretation of the Old Testament text? And then you want to analyze what the author is doing with it. So he says, analyze the author's interpretive or hermeneutical use of the Old Testament, the theological use of the Old Testament, and the rhetorical use of the Old Testament. Okay? Now, the rest of this chapter, if you want to go through and read it, if you've not read it yet, kind of elaborates on each of these steps and explains what he means. So what we're going to do is look at a passage and take it through the various steps. Sanders, we're going to do the handout on Habakkuk 2:4, which is on the, if you go to the page for week 9, it should be there under handouts.
You said it's Habakkuk?
Yeah, the under handouts, it should be Habakkuk 2:4 PDF.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so if you look in Romans 1, 16 and 17. Yes, get your workout. 16 and 17. It says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous shall live by faith." Okay? So, here we have an Old Testament reference. Okay, what's the Old Testament reference? Romans 1:17. When I was reading the NASB. So, what's the Old Testament citation or reference? Yeah, but the righteous man shall live by faith. Okay? Is it a citation, an allusion, an echo, just biblical language?
We didn't talk about echo.
Mm-hmm.
Is it in the same context that we normally put echo that is actually what was already said?
No, it's more. When Hayes is the one that talks about Richard Hayes is the one who talks about echoes in this way, and the idea here is like when you shout into the Grand Canyon and you hear it kind of fading in the distance. That's what he means by echo.
Okay, so it's not that.
So yeah, it's not that. You got citations on one end of the spectrum, and then kind of allusions, which are not direct citations, but they're pretty clearly invoking a particular passage. Echoes are kind of further down the line from that. And then kind of further down you have biblical language. It's not really alluding to any passage in particular, but just is kind of shaped by someone who, say, grew up on the King James. In this case, yeah, it seems to be a quotation, a direct quotation. And you've got a citation formula before it, as it is written, which is, a big indication that you're dealing with a quotation. Yeah, I would put them in the order of quotation, allusion, echo, and then biblical language. This is a quotation, yep. And, it's not so important that you're able to differentiate, oh, this is an illusion, not an echo, but just, generally kind of the way they're used. But this seems pretty clearly to be a quotation. Okay? Where is it from?
Okay, so we know go into the concordance or into the family.
Mm-hmm. Or you can look at footnote A on page 589 on the NIV side.
It is Habakkuk.
Yes, Habakkuk 2:4. All right. So, what's the second step?
Identify the broad New Testament context where the Old Testament reference occurred.
Okay, so the New Testament context is the letter to Romans. We've spent the past 8 weeks talking about that. So I'll assume that we kind of know what's going on in Romans. Okay, we got some idea. And we'll come back and talk about it. But all right, what about step 3? Analyze the Old Testament context. All right, what's going on in Habakkuk? Habakkuk is between Nahum and Zephaniah. You want to consider both broadly and the immediate context. So first, broadly, what's going on in Habakkuk? It won't be in that interlinear because that's just New Testament. Not Hosea, Habakkuk. Yep. What's the main theme?
That's going on. Is something wrong with the world?
Because the book of Habakkuk is a compilation of the prophets' events, but not accusation against Israel. The same as the rest of the people, and the people are waiting on God, as crying out, "How long will God? They're waiting for God rescue them." So this.
Yeah, the main theme of Habakkuk is theodicy, or basically the righteousness of God. And Habakkuk is complaining because he looks around and he says, you're supposed to be a righteous God, but I look around me and I don't see a lot of righteousness. And I don't see you doing anything about it. So, how do we square this, right?
They were bringing back anywhere.
Huh?
They were bringing back anywhere.
They were. Right, so look at the beginning of Habakkuk.
It says, he devotes his entire work to the question of the justice of God's government of the world.
Mm-hmm. The righteousness of God. Is God righteous? That's what he's calling into question. Now, right away, can you see some potential parallels or resonances with what's going on in Romans? What's the main theme of Romans?
Righteousness.
The Israelites have left and doing what was right. And they're repeating the history of what was going on.
Okay, but what about Romans more generally? What's the main theme of Romans?
Kind of trying to pull together the Jews and the Gentiles.
Okay. Why? What's the situation?
They're under the rule of Rome, and they're trying to keep them encouraged. I don't know what they're doing.
Well, Romans isn't about encouraging them to, be under Roman rule.
No, not to be under Roman rule, but to know that even though they're under Roman rule, God is still real.
Yeah, but that's not the main reason that he's writing. What's the problem that he's addressing in Romans? Division, right? You've got segregation. You've got Jews gathered over here and Gentiles gathered on the other side. And what's the problem? What does it suggest about God when Jews gather over here and say, we don't need the Gentiles?
That he's not being truthful about.
Yeah, that he's partial.
Right.
That he plays favorites.
Right.
Right? And what does it suggest about God when Gentiles gather over here and say, we don't need our Jewish brothers and sisters? That he's not being faithful to his word. Right? In either case, they are projecting an image of God that suggests that he is unrighteous.
Okay.
Right? And so the repeated theme throughout this whole book is God is righteous. Romans is also all about theodicy. Right? It's the main question in Habakkuk. It's the main question in Romans. Okay? Yes. Yes. So, this is how Habakkuk begins. The oracle which Habakkuk the prophet saw. How long, O Lord, will I call for help, and you will not hear? I cry out to you violence, yet you do not save. Why do you make me see iniquity and cause me to look on wickedness? Yes, destruction and violence are before me. Strife exists and contention arises. Therefore the law is ignored and justice is never upheld, for the wicked surround the righteous. Therefore justice comes out perverted. Okay, so what is Habakkuk's complaint to God?
Destruction and violence are all before me. There's strife and conflict.
Yeah, come on, Mr. Righteous God.
Wickedness prevails instead of righteousness.
Yeah. Yeah. Why aren't you? If you're so righteous, why aren't you doing something about this down here? Right. And then God responds, starting in verse 5. Look among the nations, observe, be astonished, wonder, because I am doing something in your days. You would not believe it if you were told. For behold, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, that fierce and impetuous people who march throughout the earth, to seize dwelling places which are not theirs. They are dreaded and feared. Their justice and authority originate with themselves. Their horses are swifter than leopards and keener than wolves in the evening. Their horsemen come galloping. Their horsemen come from afar. They fly like an eagle, swooping down to devour. All of them come for violence. Their horde of faces moves forward. They collect captives like sand. They mock at kings, and rulers are a laughing matter to them. They laugh at every fortress and heap up rubble to capture it. Then they will sweep through like the wind and pass on, but they will be held guilty, they whose strength is their God. All right, so what is God's answer?
I'm doing something.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
And what?
He said he not seen going.
Yeah, what is it he's doing? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, kind of. I'm raising up. Well, I see Babylonians in the footnote. You said Chaldeans. I have to remember who that was.
Yes.
But anyway, yeah, he's raising up another nation to take down their oppressors.
Yeah. Well, so Habakkuk starts out and says, "Look, it's wickedness down here.
Yeah.
Why aren't you going to come? When are you going to come and do something? If you are really the righteous one of Israel." And God says, "Oh, have I got a great plan for you? This is so good. I am raising up the Chaldeans, and I'm going to use them to wipe you out." Right? Yeah. They're going to wipe you out.
Oh.
And Habakkuk says, "Wait a minute. Time out. Yeah. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One?"
Oh, now he's the Holy One.
Yeah, we will not die. You, O Lord, have appointed them to judge, and you, O Rock, has established them to correct. Your eyes are too pure to approve evil. You can't look on wickedness with favor. Why do you look with favor on those who deal treacherously? Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? Why have you made men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things without a ruler over them? The Chaldeans bring all of them up with a hook, drag them away with their net, and gather them together in their fishing net. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. Therefore they offer a sacrifice to their net and burn incense to their fishing net. In other words, they're not going to give you any credit for this. Because through these things their catch is large and their food is plentiful. Will they therefore empty their net and continually slay nations without sparing? So what does Habakkuk say? Wait a minute. Time out. The Chaldeans? Really? They're the ones you're going to bring? Okay, yeah, things are bad here. They're even worse. What kind of plan is this? Right? I was complaining because the wicked are going to prosper even more if you bring the Chaldeans to. Okay, we're bad. They're worse. How in the world does that make things better? Right? And he goes on and says, they're not going to worship you for this. They worship their net and their spears because that's what they think is giving them the victory.
And I like it when he said, you can't die, but we can.
Yeah.
My whole one, you would never die. So, it don't matter, you are like
Yeah. Well, what kind of plan is this? Right? And remember what God had said, even if I tell you, you won't believe it. You won't believe it. And so then Habakkuk 2, which is where our passage comes from, starts out, I will stand on my guard post and station myself on the rampart, and I will keep watch to see what he will speak to me and how I may reply when I am reproved. So he's like, okay, I know I stepped over the line right there, and that wasn't really appropriate, but I don't care. I said it, and I'm going to stand here. I'm going to take whatever he has, to come back at me, because this is not right. This is not just. And we're supposed to serve a just God, right?
Yeah.
He's waiting on it. He's waiting on his answer from his complaint.
Yep.
Okay.
So I want to hear how you answer this, God.
Sound like me when I have that conversation.
But then you have to really check yourself, like,
Okay, so I'm sorry. I didn't mean to talk to you.
Yeah. So he said, then the Lord answered me and said, record the vision and inscribe it on tablets, that the one who reads it may run. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It hastens toward the goal, and it will not fail. Though it tarries, wait for it, for it will certainly come. It will not delay. Right? So he's giving him a vision and telling him to what? Write it down. Inscribe it in rock. Yeah. Why? Why do you need to inscribe it?
they can see it. They got to see it.
Yeah, and it's going to take some time for this to come to pass. And so you need a written record that, people can refer to and people who come after you. Yeah, exactly. Okay? Behold, verse 4, and this is our key verse. As for the proud one, his soul is not right within him, but the righteous will live by his faith. Furthermore, wine betrays the haughty man, so that he does not stay at home. He enlarges his appetite like Sheol, and he is like death, never satisfied. He also gathers to himself all nations and collects to himself all peoples. Will not all of these take up a taunt song against him, even mockery and insinuations against him, and say, woe to him who increases what is not his, for how long, and makes himself rich with loans? Will not your creditors rise up suddenly, and those who collect from you awaken? Indeed, you will become plunder for them. Because you have looted many nations, all the remainder of the peoples will loot you, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, the town, and all its inhabitants. Woe to the one who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. You have devised a shameful thing for your house, by cutting off many peoples, so you are sinning against yourself. Surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework. Woe to the one who builds a city with bloodshed and founds a town with violence. Is it not indeed from the Lord of hosts that people toil for fire and nations grow weary for nothing? For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom even to make them drunk, so as to look on their nakedness. You will be filled with disgrace rather than honor. Now you yourself drink and expose your own nakedness. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you, and utter disgrace will come upon your glory. For the violence done to Lebanon will overwhelm you, and the devastation of its beasts by which you terrified them, because of human bloodshed and violence done to the land, to the town, and all its inhabitants. What profit is the idol when its maker has carved it, or an image a teacher of falsehood? For its maker trusts in his own handiwork when he fashions speechless idols. Woe to the one who says to a piece of wood, awake! To a dumb stone, arise! And that is your teacher? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver. There is no breath at all inside it. But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. All right?
But when you read it, when you kind of, I guess that's why context helps. Because reading this without this prelim, that's like Google Go. I mean,
You just read it. It's like you just
some
read
of
it.
it kind of jumps out at you, but it doesn't
Not
mean
really.
it.
Yeah.
But then when you have preferenced it and kind of given us the idea of what people are thinking when they're writing it, it brings it to life.
Mm-hmm.
This reads completely different now than it did. I mean, I kind of skimmed it because it didn't mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't go in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which often happens, right? We start reading, especially the poetry in the Bible, I find you read just kind of
And it just.
You're reading words, and it doesn't stick or anything. And so basically what God seems to be saying is, yeah, they're going to come and wipe you out, but they're going to overstep. Right? And then I'm going to be justified in bringing judgment on them. Right? And, remember in Isaiah 40, he says, tell Jerusalem she's suffered double for all her sins. Well, think about that. How is that just?
Well,
That you suffered double. Yeah. Because Israel's also being wicked right now. And so the point is, yeah, it's going to be bad for a while because you guys have to come under judgment because you have done things that you should not be doing. But I will be waiting for you on the other side.
It's about like when your parents tell you, I'm spanking you for the husband.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They won't hurt me.
Never has hurt my mom before it hurt me. I don't know what's
Yeah. Yeah.
Like God said, I'm spanking you, but I love it. I'm going to
Yeah.
spank you, but I love it.
I want to make it all better.
Yeah. So he says, take this vision, which is basically, I'll be waiting for you on this other side if you persevere through. Right?
If you live through this, I'll be waiting.
Well, the danger is what? You say, well, forget this, and you turn away from God.
Of course.
Right? Because you don't understand why you're being judged, because you've been so good. And he's,
Yeah. Which happens to a lot of things causing such division, is because people don't understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And then chapter 3 goes on, it's a poem of praise to God for his inscrutable ways. And,
Well,
yeah.
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 From now on, when I read that, when we stand up in church and do the Lord is in his holy temple and everything, that's going to come to my mind. What is going on?
Exactly.
After that was being said, now that
Mm-hmm.
Make a good life.
Yep. All right, so now, how does the NASB translate the Hebrew? It's on your sheet. The relevant part that Paul's going to cite.
The righteous one,
Mm-hmm.
by its faithful.
Okay. Well, how does the NASB translate?
The righteous root of right faith.
All right. The righteous
live by his faith.
will live by his faith. Okay? Now, this is based on the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew. And what does the Hebrew read?
But a righteous one by his faithfulness will live.
But a righteous one, what was it?
By his faithfulness will.
By his or its faithfulness.
Well, we have to be careful that do the Septuagint.
All right, what does the Septuagint say?
Oh,
It's the NETS below is the New English translation of the Septuagint, which, by the way, you can download the individual books for free from the web. And the NETS, the translation philosophy, most Septuagint translations keep an eye on the Hebrew. So they're trying to kind of render the Hebrew as well as the Greek. The NETS, their translation strategy, which is followed sometimes more successfully, sometimes less. But let's assume we are Greek speakers and this is our Bible and we don't know Hebrew. What is it that we're reading? Okay, so they're trying to just translate the Greek without keeping an eye on the Hebrew to see what it really means. Well, the question is what does it say? And then we got to look to see if there are differences and all of that. All right, so what is the Septuagint? How does it read? Yeah, by faith will live. All right, and then what does Paul say in Romans?
righteous by faith shall live.
Right? Now, what are the key differences that you note in these 3 or 4 different versions?
By his faith, by my faith, or by faith.
By his faith, by his
Faithfulness.
faithfulness,
By my faith,
by my faith, and by faith. All right, so the first thing to note is whether we're dealing with faith or faithfulness. Right? The NASB translates by his faith. It's supposedly translating from the Masoretic text. But the word here is faithfulness. And that word in Hebrew cannot mean faith. It means faithfulness. So why does the NASB translate it as faith? Well, because they know what Paul's going to do with it. They want to make sure when people flip back to look up what the text says, it matches. Because if you looked back and instead of saying by faith shall live, it said by faithfulness shall live, what would that suggest?
Which one's correct?
Well, Hebrew reads by his or its faithfulness. Now, this is the other big difference. We've got his or its, my, and then Paul just decides to leave that out. So,
His, its.
yeah, it could be either one in Hebrew. And if it's his, then who's the his? A righteous one by his faithfulness will live. The righteous one, right? If it's its, what is the its? Probably the vision. Right? So the vision is going to prove true. Remember, God has said it may tarry, but wait for it because it's going to prove true. It's going to prove faithful. Okay? So, a righteous one will live either by his faithfulness or by the faithfulness of the vision. Right? Well, faithfulness suggests what? That you're doing something, right?
I guess so.
Okay? The Septuagint changes this by my faith. And now, the word here, what is the Greek word for faith?
That's flesh. It's
Yeah, experience.
Yes.
How you pronounce
Pistis. Pistis. Okay? Pistis in Greek can mean either faith or faithfulness. Remember we talked about that when we were doing word studies and kind of the Campbell reading of trust versus belief versus faithfulness. They also changed this to mind. This is a common translation error. It's a different yod. The Hebrew letter yod is like that, and the Hebrew letter vav is like that. And so if you get something that's kind of in the middle, you're kind of guessing whether it's my or his is. They thought it was my. If it's my, then who is the my? Yeah, the righteous will live by my, and then what does that mean pistis has to be? Faith or faithfulness?
My faith.
It would have to be faithfulness if it's
God's
God.
faith.
Right? You wouldn't, by my faith.
Yeah.
By God's faith. No, that doesn't. It's God's faithfulness, right?
Right.
Which would be the same as, its faithfulness. The vision's faithful. God stands behind the vision.
Right.
So in Greek, you can't. It shouldn't be translated by my faith. It would have to be by my faithfulness. So how does Paul get by faith?
We're going to do a pronoun.
Yeah. The only way to make this work is to take the my out. Because if you take the my out,
Then you can interpret it the way you want.
then pistis can become faith. Right? It can't be faith here because the my means it has to be faithfulness, which is what the Hebrew actually says. So the only way the righteous shall live by faith comes to be is through some textual manipulation that Paul does.
Somebody.
Right.
Right.
Does that make sense?
So in the king, he is the righteous one of God, or the being.
No, the righteous one is the person.
Well, it could be, his can be faithfulness. It would be his faith.
It's his faithfulness.
Perfectly faithful.
The righteous will live by his faithfulness, by staying true.
Or God's faithfulness.
Nope. By his faithfulness.
No, I mean, it can be either mine is mine works for God's faithfulness.
Right.
His works for the righteous one's faithfulness. So I thought I was comparing.
Yes.
Both can have faithfulness.
Yes. But Paul doesn't want to make this mean faithfulness.
He's going to be faithful.
He says it's faith. And again, this is kind of crucial to his whole argument. Right? Because if it's faithfulness suggests what?
It's the audience.
Yeah, what you're doing. Right? So is this, really the proof text for, faith that we tend to make it out to be? So is Paul twisting the scriptures to make it?
Yes.
Well, somebody is, because the scribes kind of did their little thing too sometimes.
Okay.
So it should have been faith. Paul is saying faith, but it's our faithfulness that we should live by.
Yeah, the Hebrew and the Greek are both talking about faithfulness here, not faith, not belief, not trust. All right? So what do we do with that? Because this is pretty important to Pauline theology, right? Can't get rid of it.
We come down to these next steps.
Well, think about it this way. What does it mean in the context of Habakkuk that we just read for someone to be faithful?
Waiting on God, yeah.
And trusting in his vision.
His vision in the whole
Right?
plan.
Not in your step.
So in other words, in this context, to be faithful means to have faith. You see what Paul has done? He has changed it in order to bring out a sense that he would suggest is inherent in what the text actually said originally.
That the vision was broke back then, but now it's time for you to put it to action that your faith is.
Yeah, well, not so much referencing the vision back then, but what is being said here, when it talks about faithfulness here, faithfulness in this context is not about doing the law more zealously or anything. It's about trusting the vision that God has given you in the midst of a situation that seems to call God's righteousness into question. Right? And so what's going to get you through, what's going to get the righteous through to life is having faith in the faithfulness of God. That God is going to be faithful, that he is righteous, even though everything around you seems to call that into question.
Faith in the faithfulness.
Yes.
That he's going to keep his promise.
Yes. Yes. And so in the ancient world, authors would often change citations in order to bring out a nuance or a sense that they wanted to make sure you got, but that was inherent in the original quotation. Does that make sense? So yes, Paul has changed it, but he has changed it to bring out what he wants you to see as being inherent in what it was originally. Okay? Because in the original, to be faithful meant to have faith.
So if someone was to say that the righteous one will live, righteous one by its faithfulness will live by his faith? Or live by faith?
By faith, yeah. And again, Paul leaves out the pronoun because you can't have that pronoun and make it mean faith. It would have to mean faithfulness. So why would he do that? Well, so say somebody isn't familiar with the Old Testament, right? They read it, they don't know the context, but they get the point.
That's true.
Right? Say someone really knows their Old Testament well. Dr. Dora's reading. She reads this. She says, well, wait a minute, Paul. It says by faithfulness, not faith. They said, well, exactly, but in the context, what does it mean to be faithful? Well, to have faith. Okay, then, that's what I said. Right? So he is written in such a way that you get the point whether you know the Old Testament context or not. Yes. Yes. Whereas if he had written, but a righteous one by his faithfulness will live, if you know the context, you might be able to say, okay, well, yeah, that's about faith and trusting in God's promise. But if you don't know the context, you're not going to read that the right way. And so he has changed it in a way to bring out the true meaning of the original quotation. Does that make sense?
Sure. It makes sense when you explain it.
Yeah, but you always want to go back and look because it's not always as straightforward as we think it is, or even that our English translations make it seem.
You could change what you preach.
You don't stop holding preaching altogether and start reading.
Now, don't go change what you
You
think.
just stop preaching and just
Because
start
usually,
reading and
you
study.
look at the Bible, you're gonna go back and research the fact. And then commentary to the commentary to see if they think on the same term. That's part of the Bible. You don't look at it that way.
Yep. If you want to see another good example of this, look at Ephesians. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but flip over there quickly, Ephesians 4. Verse 4. I'm sorry, chapter 4. Verse 7 and 8. Someone want to read that?
But to each one of us grace is given according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when you ascended on high, you made captive a host of captives, and you gave gifts to men.
Okay. So what is he using this quote to establish?
The diversity of gifts.
What about gifts?
The diversity of gifts.
Okay, yeah, that Christ gave, gifts, and that's why we have these different gifts. And he's going to go on, down in verse 11, so he gave some as apostles and some as prophets. So it's about, Christ giving gifts, right?
Right.
All right, where's this from?
It's from Psalms 68.
Mm-hmm. 18, I think.
I mean, 18.
Yep. Is it a quotation, allusion, echo, or just biblical language?
I think it's both.
Yeah, we've got a quotation formula in front of it again, so it's pretty clearly a quotation. All right, look back at Psalm 68. Because again, that should be your first step anytime you have an Old Testament quotation. Go back and read the original context. All right, someone read Psalm 68:18.
What translation you want?
Doesn't matter.
Let's do a course. What was that from?
Sure.
You have to get these things organized. You have ascended on high. You have led captive your captives.
So far, so good.
You have received gifts among men, even among the rebellious also. Let the Lord God dwell. But even among the rebellious also, that the Lord God may dwell there.
Okay. Did you notice any differences from Paul's citation? What's the difference?
You got to figure out. You have to live chapter. It's your chapter. So he gave it up. So that's it. You have received gifts among men. And then talking about even among the brothers also.
Okay, so he cuts off the last bit.
He did.
But what about what's there? What's the big difference?
For you and me.
Nope. I mean, that is a difference, but what's the, there's a bigger difference.
Your chapter. You led chapter the whole chapter. You said, you led chapter your chapter.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying?
Nope.
You have received gifts among you. You have received gifts among you. I don't know.
Versus
Dr.
what?
Trey,
Yeah, Sanders.
is it the rebellious?
It's not the rebellious, because that part just gets clipped out. Look at the last phrase that Paul cites. He gave gifts to men versus what?
Versus the Lord God and well.
No.
You have received gifts among you. Oh. I guess I'm just not getting what you're talking about.
In Ephesians, Paul says he gave gifts. In Psalms, it says he received gifts. Right? In Paul, the whole point is Christ gives gifts. Right? And that's why he's citing this to justify the fact that Christ has given gifts. In Psalms, though, you go look it up, and it says, yeah, you have received gifts from among men.
So, I received gifts from among.
Right. So in Psalms, God is the one receiving the gifts. But when Paul cites it, Christ is the one who's giving the gifts. Right. It's a question of which direction is the gift giving going. Right?
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So again, once you notice that, then you can kind of wrestle with what is Paul doing here. Right? But if you don't go back and look it up and look at kind of what's going on, then you're not going to even know there's an issue, which is what we usually do.
Yeah, and if you think about it, Paul is right, because a lot of people tell, I walk up here and say, my spirit telling me that you was called into the ministry. You understand where I'm coming from? I'm giving you a gift that is not mine to give. It's God who do the giving. So
possibly. The question here, though, is what is Paul doing with the Old Testament text? What enables him to take a text that said God receives gifts from men and change it into he gives gifts to men? And is he, again, twisting it, or is what he's doing consistent with the overall context? And that's why, again, you want to look at the context of what's going on in Psalm 68. You want to look at the language that's being used, look at the Hebrew, look at the Greek. Where does this change get introduced? Is it something Paul introduces, or is it something that the Septuagintal writer has already introduced? Yes. Are there other people who are citing this verse in Paul's day, and how are they citing it if they do? Those are the kind of questions you want to ask and the kind of work you want to do. Does that make sense? Well, not necessarily those, because those are going to be English translations. It's more important what was around in Paul's day, right? So you can leave all the English Bibles in the box. Yes. Okay. So back to Romans. So again, Romans 1:16-17 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." Now, why do you have to say I'm not ashamed of the gospel?
Romans 16-17.
1:16-17. Yeah.
I'm not ashamed of the gospel.
To the Jew first, and also to the Greek. Now again, why does he...
Why does he feel like he's obligated to have to say that?
Yeah, why does he have to say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel? Probably because there are some people around saying, you ought to be ashamed of yourself, Paul. Associating with those people. Well, not because he's Roman, but because who's he associating with? The Gentiles, right? And I can guarantee you there were Jewish people who were saying, yeah, Paul, you shouldn't be doing that. That's not what God called us to do. Yeah. Yeah. He says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed to go stand over here by my Gentile brothers and sisters, which the gospel enables, because the gospel is the power of salvation for all, for both Jew and Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed. Right? Again, back to this question, is God righteous? From faith to faith. Now, there are a lot of ways of interpreting that. If you have the NRSV, it has something different. But I would say most times where you have this from the same thing to the same thing, or from one thing to the same thing, it means kind of an ever-increasing measure. So we're going from glory to glory, right? So what he seems to be saying is the righteousness of God is revealed in ever-increasing measures of faith, right? So it's one thing to trust God in the midst of a situation where you're being overrun by the Babylonians. That's one level of faith. It's a whole degree higher to say, okay, now what God is calling you to do is to transgress the law and rejoin the nations. Right? But you can take those higher steps of faith because you've seen God's faithfulness in previous steps. Right? And so this is how our individual faith walk progresses. It's as you see him be faithful in small things that you're able to take bigger steps of faith, which enable you to then take even bigger steps of faith, until eventually God can tell you, okay, this is what I need you to do, and you can go do it regardless of what the people around you are saying, because you know you've heard God's voice. And so even though everybody around you is saying, no, God doesn't call us to do things like that, you say, well, he called me to do this. Right? Does that make sense? Okay? All right. Now let's look at Romans 9 and 10 again. Yeah. We started looking at this last week. And if you remember, we said that Romans... What is Paul dealing with in Romans 9 to 11? Well, first of all, what is he dealing with in Romans 1 to 8?
Trying to bring the unity.
Right, that's what he's doing in the whole letter. He's trying to bring Jew and Gentile together. What is he doing in 1 to 8 specifically to do that, to address that? Which side is he addressing?
Gentile.
Try the other side.
Jews.
Good, the Jewish side. Yeah. He's addressing the Jewish side of the problem. And remember, what does it suggest about God when Jews gather over here and say we don't need our Gentile brothers and sisters? That he's partial, right? And so 1 to 8 is all about establishing God's impartiality, right? And what were the Jews boasting in? What makes them special? Yeah, circumcision, which ties them to Abraham. So Abrahamic descent, as manifested in circumcision. And then what's the other big thing that they boast in? Yeah, they had the law. They had the law. And so he goes through chapter 3, says, well, the law is only going to do you good if you do the law, but the law itself says you don't. So you're no better than they are, and you're both getting in on faith. And then chapter 4 deals with Abrahamic descent. It says, okay, yeah, you can call on Abraham as father. Well, guess what? So can they. Because he's the father of both the uncircumcised and the circumcised. So that doesn't give you a leg up either. So those things don't make you more special than the other side. All right? In chapters 9 to 15, he's addressing the Gentile side of the problem, which is basically suggesting what? That God is not faithful to his promises, to his word. Okay? And so to address that, you've got to address the question of Israel. How can God make so many promises to Israel, and yet now most of them are on the outside looking in? Doesn't that suggest God can't be trusted to fulfill his promises no matter what? Okay? And so now he's going to have to address the same two issues, Abrahamic descent and law, but from the other side. Is God just if he overlooks their Abrahamic descent? Is he just if he overlooks their having the law and trying to do it? Okay, and he's going to go through and conclude, yes, he is. Okay, and how does he do this? Well, 6 through 13 sets the stage. It says, not all Israel are from Israel, and not all of Abraham's seed are children of God. Right, so he says, Abrahamic descent, it was never based strictly on flesh. You always had to be born through the promise. That's how it was at the beginning. Right? And as for having the law, it was never about works. Right? Because Israel, Jacob, was chosen when they were in the womb, before they had done anything good or bad. So if you go back to the foundational moments of how Israel was founded, it was never strictly about biological descent, and it was never strictly about good works. It was always about being born of the promise and about, having God's choice. Okay? So, 14 through 29 is then going to develop this idea of God not being unrighteous in overlooking their Abrahamic descent. Okay, and what is he going to do here? He's going to go back to the Exodus and say, well, what did God tell Moses? I'll have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will harden whom I harden. And we know he does that because he hardened Pharaoh. He's told Pharaoh, look, I have raised you up to demonstrate my power in you. Okay? So you have kind of vessels of mercy, like Israel in the Exodus, on whom God showers his glory to show his mercy. And you have common vessels that are created and that will demonstrate God's greatness by becoming a venue for his power, his wrath to be manifest. Okay? Make sense? And he says then, we're in chapter 9. This is 14 through 29. Okay? And then notice 9:21. Does not the potter have a right over the clay to make from the same lump one vessel for honorable? So this is where we're talking about Israel. You are one lump, but he's taken some of you to be vessels of mercy and others of you to be vessels headed for destruction. Here's the thing. If you are God's people, he is going to use you to glorify his name. Mercy and have him pour out his glory on you. The hard way is to resist him and have him demonstrate his wrath and power. Okay? Now he says there's a group headed for destruction, and he's willing to demonstrate his power, but he waits in order that he can make the riches of the glory of his mercy known on these vessels for mercy. So why is he not pouring out his wrath? Because he's trying to highlight his mercy in this group over here in hopes that some of those heading for wrath will see it and turn it and wait a minute, this looks like a much better way. And so I'm going to go stand over here. Right? That's why Paul's going to say in chapter 11, I make the most as I can of my ministry among Gentiles, playing it up when I'm among my Jewish brothers and sisters, in hopes that I might make them jealous and save some of them.
Is that why God did not actually destroy Satan? Because that comes up sometimes.
That's a story for another time.
But it's coming plain to things that why things happen the way they happen. Because God's mercy and his wrath, and he's the one that chooses.
Yeah, and if you didn't have a problem with it when you were on the side receiving mercy, And Pharaoh was on the side being hardened. You don't have a leg to stand on to complain to God, hey, look, it's not fair that you've hardened me and not my brother and sister. Because if you're okay with it then you should be okay with it now. Right? Right. So that section is showing how God is not unrighteous in overlooking their Abrahamic descent, because it was never just about Abrahamic descent in the first place. Okay? And there are still some, like Paul, who are these vessels for mercy that have been predestined. And note, the vessels for mercy are predestined. He never talks about those headed for destruction as being predestined. But there are some who are predestined for mercy in hopes of drawing others into that process. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether you were predestined or not. It's whether you've tasted his mercy or not. And if you've tasted his mercy, then you are to become a vessel of mercy, showing his glory through that so that you can draw others in. Does that make sense? Okay. In verse 30 through the rest of chapter 10, he's going to address the issue of works and the law. Okay? So what does he say? What shall we say then? The Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as though it were by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone, just as it is written, Behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. The one who believes in him or in it will not be put to shame. Sometimes translated, will not be disappointed. But the word here is, will not be put to shame. Now, where have we seen that before? I want to preach the gospel to you, for I am not ashamed. Right? So shame is about this particular step. And he says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, even though it means I have transgressed the law and rejoined the nations. Why? Well, again, Paul's great insight is that God is now calling Jews to express their faith through transgressing the law. Formerly, he called them to express their faith by obeying the law. Now he's calling for them to express their faith by transgressing the law. Which means, if God is now calling you to cross over the law and go out there, and you say, no, I'm going to stay in here and keep doing these things, then your righteousness becomes based on what? On the works. Right? Because you're not doing what God has called you to do. Okay? Right. It's not that the law is inherently bad or evil or that we shouldn't do anything or anything like that. It's that you've not stayed current with what God is calling you to do, and as a result, your righteousness now becomes based on works that you're doing because you're not following in faith. All right? So, chapter 10. Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and my prayer to God for them, Israel, is for their salvation. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. Do you hear the irony there? What was the great benefit of being Israel? Yeah, they had knowledge of God. Right? They knew God. They knew what he wanted. They had a relationship with him. Gentiles didn't. That was the problem with Gentiles. They did not know God. Israel knew it. That was the whole benefit to being a Jew. And yet what does he say here? I bear them witness they have great zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. The very thing they lack is the knowledge they claim to have. Right? And what this also shows, zeal is not enough. There are a lot of pastors out there who have great zeal for God. But if you don't marry that zeal with knowledge, you're going to end up fighting against the very God you claim to be serving. Just like Paul. Right? What did he end up doing? He ended up persecuting Christians and Christianity in the name of God, in the name of serving God and doing what God wanted. He did not have, he had great zeal. In fact, he says, I was zealous above everyone. No one had more zeal than I did. But he didn't have knowledge. Right? Now, what is it they don't have knowledge of? Verse 3. For, not knowing about God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own, they did not subject themselves to the righteousness of God. Now, if you're reading in the NRSV, it decides to help you by interpreting the genitive there as the righteousness that comes from God. I don't think that's what it's talking about. It's not talking about righteousness comes from God to us. You just got to say, I believe, and the Jews refused to do that.
They established their own.
Yeah, that God is righteous. They don't understand what it means to say that God is righteous. Why? Because if you understood what that meant, you would know that the law cannot be the means for blessing. Why? Well, why can the law not be the means of blessing if God is righteous?
Because the law was based on the works and not.
But that's not why. Because God could choose, he could bless, people who did the right thing. We'll get there. We're not there yet. She's eager to get to that verse.
No, I'm just about
Not yet.
Not yet.
Why?
Dr. Trey,
Yes, Sanders.
would you ask that question?
Yeah. Why would a knowledge of God's righteousness imply that the law cannot be the means through which God ultimately blesses? God's righteousness. The fact that God is righteous. Well, to whom was the law given?
Because the law was just a guide, a tutor to for the people to realize how holy He is and how unholy we are.
It is that. Paul says in Galatians the law was given to basically inculcate faith. But that wouldn't explain why you would need a knowledge of God's righteousness. And why a knowledge of God's righteousness would show you that the law can't be the means of blessing. What did the Jews do to receive the law? Nothing. Nothing. So if the law becomes, then God becomes partial. Because he gave it to one group of people and not to anyone else, but not because they were especially worthy. In fact, the whole point of giving it to them was they weren't worthy, and therefore anything that they ended up doing, it would be clear God was doing it. Right? Because they were not a great, powerful nation that was... Right. Right. Exactly. That was the whole point. Right. But if that's the means of blessing, then God has played favorites by giving it to some and not others. If you really understood God's righteousness, you would know that the law, although it points to what he's going to do, cannot be the vehicle for it. Because that would be unfair. Does that make sense? And so, by Jews refusing to enter into Christ, who is open to all, saying, no, I'm going to continue to do this law, he says, by making that choice, you're effectively making it about your works. Right? Because God is now calling you to express your faith by transgressing the law and rejoining the nations in Christ. Does that make sense?
So they were transgressing the knowledge of God. They was going against the knowledge of God because they had the law. And if God would have went that way, then the Gentiles wouldn't have been included in the blessing.
Right. Exactly. And that would make God partial. Because again, it's not that the Jews were especially worthy and that's why they received the law. God gave it to them just out of his grace and mercy. And that's why he says, if they really understood what it means when they say God is righteous, they would know that he doesn't play favorites, and therefore the law cannot be the means through which the blessing comes. Okay? Now, how do we know that? Now we get to verse 4.
Okay.
Yes. 4!
So Christ.
For Christ is the end of the law, for righteousness to everyone who believes.
Yes. Now this is the verse you're going to be looking at for your word study,
Oh no!
which hopefully you're aware of because it's due next week.
I saw that.
I thought we were gonna practice.
I'm like, okay, what's he doing here?
I thought we was practicing. Ten plus 10:4.
That's
Yes.
one out of that book with
Words today on.
Telos. Yeah, so you want to look it up in BDAG, which is the lexicon, remember, and you want to look it up in the TD&T. By the way, BDAG, because it is the author's initials, you do not italicize. TD&T, because it's the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, is a title, and so you italicize that abbreviation. And you can refer to them as BDAG, BDAG, and TD&T. I'll post an example of how to cite them.
D-N-T.
Yes, those are the two.
Would you say them again, Dr. Trick? BDAG and what?
Yeah, BDAG, BDAG, which is the lexicon, and BDAG are the initials of the 4 authors and translators. Bauer, Danker, Arndt, and Gingert.
You're breaking up on.
Okay, BDAG.
Okay.
Right. And you want to make sure you use the 3rd edition of BDAG. Yeah, it should be in both the Alabama Library and the library here.
And the other one was
TD&T, Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. That's the 10-volume blue set.
in the library.
It's in the library, yes. Okay. All right.
I didn't look at that one. I just got the.
Okay, and what you're going to look at is, for Christ is the telos of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So what does telos mean in this verse? Okay, and so remember the basic procedure. You go through and you discover the semantic range. What are all the possible things it could mean? Then there would probably be some that you can eliminate immediately because they don't fit fairly obviously, but then others that could potentially be fits. And so then you've got to look at the context. Okay? You could look at other instances of Paul's usage and that kind of thing. Though again, the most important thing to consider is the immediate context. Okay? All right, let me go ahead and read the rest of the passage, and then we'll come back and talk about it a bit. For Moses writes that the man who practices the right, and note we're starting with another 4. So now we're explaining our statement in verse 4, which was itself explaining the statement in verse 3. 4, Moses writes that the man who practices the righteousness which is based on law shall live by that righteousness. But the righteousness based on faith speaks thus: do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith which we are preaching. That if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that Jesus raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. For with the heart man believes, resulting in righteousness, and with the mouth he confesses, resulting in salvation. For the scripture says, whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, abounding in riches for all who call upon him, for whoever will call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Okay? Did you get a chance to read the Hayes piece for this week? The Hayes piece you'll want to read because it offers an interpretation of this passage, and it would be good to interact with in your paper, whether you agree or disagree. And he's looking primarily at this Old Testament reference. Okay, so in chapter 10, in that portion we just read, what's the first Old Testament reference that you see? 10 verses 5 and following. So starting in verse 5, what Old Testament references do you see? Mm-hmm. There's actually one. Okay, yeah, that's actually referring back to Leviticus 18:5. Okay? And then we have, the ones that in the NASB at least appears in all block letters. Do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, who will descend into the abyss. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. Now, where's that coming from?
This is verse 6, coming from Deuteronomy 30.
Mm-hmm. So let's flip back to Deuteronomy 30. Mm-hmm. Let's look at verses 11 through 14. Sure. Starting with verse 11.
For this commandment which I command you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it out of reach. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will go up to heaven for us to get it for us and make us hear it, that we may observe it. Nor is it beyond the sea that you should say, who will cross the sea for us to get it for us and make us hear it, that we may observe it. But the word is very near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may observe it.
So what is this passage talking about?
As men are the statutes, the commandments, which are written in this book, and for this commandment, the commandment today is not too difficult. The commandment that he just said about not what? Righteousness, which is based, man should live by righteousness.
Well, it's about the law, right? It's basically saying, this law is not too hard for you, right? You don't need somebody to go get the word for you and come back or go across the sea and come back to tell you what it is you need to do. The word is near you. It's in you. And therefore you can do it. Okay? Yeah.
I'm not just saying it's not too hard. By the time you get to reading about going across seas and all this, then you get to interpreting that into what you're reading when it's just fluff.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't, anyway,
Yeah. So this is about the law, right? You can do the law. It's doable. What does Paul say it's referring to?
What is 5? Romans 5 or something?
Yeah, and following. For Moses writes that the man who practices the righteousness which is based on law shall live by that righteousness. But the righteousness based on faith speaks thus: do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven? Well, that is to bring Christ down. Or who will descend into the abyss? That is to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith which we are preaching.
Just that.
So what does Paul apply this language to?
The word is new, and the word of faith is your preaching. If you confess with your mouth, Jesus is Lord. Salvation.
Well, the gospel. Right? He's saying this is the gospel. But when Moses spoke those words, what was Moses referring to? The law. And so now Paul is using Moses' description of the law as something near and doable. He's using it to say that describes the gospel over against the law. Well, so again, the question becomes, what in the world is Paul doing? And on what basis does he do this? Right? Now look, if you go back to Deuteronomy, look how the chapter ends. It continues on. The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that you may observe it. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity and death and adversity, in that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. Right? This is the passage Jews would go to say, why do I need to stay? Well, because God said, stay in here and do what I've told you to do. But if your heart turns away and you will not obey, but are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not prolong your days in the land where you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess it. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants, by loving the Lord your God, by obeying his voice, and by holding fast to him. For this is your life and the length of your days, that you may live in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. Right? So what is Moses saying here? God says, I'm setting before you today life and death. Choose life. And what does it mean to choose life? Yeah, to cling to his voice, right? Or obey his voice by holding fast to him. Why are you to walk in his commandments? Because you're holding fast to him and obeying his voice. Right? What is the concern in 11 to 14? It's where are we going to get the word to hear? Right? And the point is, you don't have to have anybody bring it back. You've already got the word. You know what he's saying. Right? Now again, what Paul seems to be saying is, if you are hearkening to his voice, he's now telling you to do something different. Namely, transgress the law and come out here and rejoin the nations. But it's kind of the height of chutzpah to quote this passage to prove that you should obey the gospel in transgressing the law instead of obeying the law.
Okay? That's why I say it seems contradictory.
Yeah, and you're not alone. Lots of people think that. Right? Now this Hayes piece, he's looking at this, and he argues that Paul is basically saying that the righteousness based on law in verse 5 and the righteousness based on faith are the same thing. It's the general summary of the article. I'm doing a general summary of what he argues, right? And he does this by, when you look at verse 6, what's the opening conjunction in verse 6?
But righteousness based on faith.
Yeah, so but, right? If you look in the Greek, what is the Greek for but?
6, it is.
It is something, right? And this is important to note about how the interlinear works. Remember, if there's, let's see, where are we, 10:6? Okay.
The but is up there with DE.
Right. So when you see something like the but, and it has a number beneath it, that means there is a Greek word, but it's not occurring in this place. And you need to find it is, or find where it is written in italics up above, in superscript. Right? Dead. Right? Now you've done your Greek quiz. What does dead mean? How can we translate dead? But is one way. What's the other way? And. Right? So Hayes is going to argue that the dead here should be and. It's not contrasting these things. It's saying they're the same thing. Okay? I'm not convinced that works. Because when you have the righteousness based on law versus the righteousness based on faith, and you're citing Leviticus 18:5 and then something else, you seem to be contrasting those things. One is based on works, one is based on faith, which is the way he uses it and speaks about it in Galatians. So it seems to me he's making a contrast here between the righteousness based on law and the righteousness based on faith. Okay? Now, if you look on page 75 of the Hayes article, the second to last line. Mm-hmm.
For Christ is the telos of the law, the righteousness to everyone who believes.
Okay, that's good. How is that different from the NASB?
The righteousness to everyone who believes. For Christ is the end of the law, the righteousness to everyone.
What?
The Christ is the telos of the law.
So he leaves the Greek telos in instead of translating it, but that's not what I'm looking for.
Of course not.
Of course. What's the difference between Hayes' citation here on the bottom of page 75? This is on Canvas, by the way, Sanders, the Hayes piece, and the NASB, of Romans 10:4.
He says, righteous to everyone. Well, that's not right. Righteous to telos. He didn't tell us.
Yeah, but that's not the difference.
For righteousness to everyone who believes. For Christ is the. For Christ is the. For righteousness to everyone. I'm here.
There's a difference.
Christ is the end of the law.
It's a capital L. That's how I'm scrapping now.
Okay, that's good. Not what I'm looking for. We've got a
Righteousness to
capital L.
everyone who believes. Righteousness.
Okay,
I think
what's telos mean?
in
Yeah, so same thing.
the Christ.
Yeah, that's not what I'm pointing
But
to.
that's
Yeah, isn't that not different?
It is different.
because it's a different word for tell us.
Nope, that's not the difference.
So
Christ is the end of the law. The Christ is the end of the law.
it's a quote.
The righteousness to everyone who believes. The righteousness of everyone who lives.
Yeah, so what's the difference?
No, that's it. But what is the righteousness of God?
Not looking closely enough.
Say what?
You're not looking closely enough.
Okay.
I'm missing somewhere.
I see quotation, but that could be because he's quoting.
Yeah, Hayes is quoting Romans 10:4.
Right, that doesn't mean.
So
And the question is, how is his translation different from the translation in the NASB? There's a significant difference. And I'm not talking about the fact that he leaves telos untranslated.
Is it in?
That's it.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
it. What?
comma after the close of
Yeah. What difference does that make?
a lot, because it separates it.
Yes. Yes. It breaks it up. And it makes Christ as the telos of the law into an absolute statement. Right? Now, he can do this because he's interpreting telos as fulfillment. Right? Christ is the fulfillment of the law. For righteousness to everyone who believes. So that's what the fulfillment of the law. Christ brings righteousness to everyone who believes. And so then he sees this as people are, what he goes on, people looking for Christ because that's actually what the law is pointing to. And that's how Paul can equate the law and the gospel, because they're both pointing to Christ. Right? I don't think there should be a comma there. I think he's saying, for Christ is the telos of the law with respect to righteousness. Now, what does that mean? Which means what?
He's not partial.
Okay, but how does Christ being the end of the law with respect to righteousness, how is that different from saying Christ is the end of the law? What does it not mean anymore? What is the law no longer post-Christ? It's no longer a means to what? Mm-mm.
A means to God.
Mm.
A means to.
What does he say? Christ is the telos of the law with respect to righteousness.
So at the end of the law, you have to get through Christ, get righteous through Christ, not through the law.
Yes. The law, in Christ, God opens up a new way for Jewish faith to find expression. Formerly, he called them to express their faith by obeying the law. Now he is calling them to express their faith by transgressing the law and rejoining the nations in Christ. Which means that the law is no longer the path to righteousness. Christ puts an end to the law as the path to righteousness. Because now God is calling them to do something else. Which means that if you stay and insist, no, my righteousness is based on doing this law, you're not hearkening to his voice, and you have set up your own system of righteousness that's based on doing these works. Does that make sense? Good. And so what is Paul doing then with this, Moses and the law and the righteousness of faith? He says, for Moses writes that the man who practices the righteousness which is based on law shall live by that righteousness, right? So if you're going to make law the basis, then you've got to make sure you do it and you keep doing it. But the righteousness based on faith says something different. It says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven? That is to bring Christ down. Or who will descend into the abyss? That is to bring Christ up in from the death. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith which we are preaching. That if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. And he goes on. But why is he pulling in this passage where Moses was speaking about the law? Because the same principle undergirds their attempts to find righteousness under the law with their attempts to find righteousness in Christ. It's all about faith. It was never about the works. It was all about the faith and the attempt to be faithful to what God was calling you to do. In other words, the law and the gospel have the same underlying principle. Nothing changed except the vehicle through which God called you to express it. Yes. Yes, the vehicle is Jesus. So now you transgress the law into Christ, who's accursed under the law. And if you embrace him, then you're inviting the curse of the law. But that's okay because God is waiting for you on the other side. And that is how you find life. The gospel shows that the way to life is through death. And the great, upside down kingdom of God.
So now God got something else to cover. Because it's coming right back to if you survive, I'll be waiting for you to survive. You
Right.
survive, did it, but
Right.
it's similar to what you
Right. The righteous will find life
Yeah, on the other
by faith. Right? And he can make the same argument from Abraham, which he does in Galatians. Abraham and Isaac. What does Abraham do? He offers up Isaac, who was the promised child to whom everything was to come. Well, why can he do that? Because he knows he can't inherit if he's dead. Right?
So he knew he wasn't going to kill him.
He didn't know he wasn't going to kill him. He knew he wasn't going to stay dead.
Right.
That's why when he tells me, you wait for us here, we are going to go up and worship and we are going to come back.
So what God...
Yeah, he didn't know how God was going to do it.
He was going to bring him back.
Exactly. He knew that Isaac couldn't stay dead because he had to inherit everything. And think about Isaac too. Isaac, he's big enough, he's strong enough, he could have gotten away if he wanted. He gets up on the wood, which is the same word Paul uses for the cross. He gets up on the wood, trusting his Father to see him through death to life on the other side.
His father naturally and spiritually.
Yeah, and so Paul says, you want to be a true son of Abraham? Be like Isaac.
Oh, no,
Yes, get up on the wood.
Get on the wood.
Trusting that by embracing Christ and the cross and receiving death as a result, God, your Father, will be waiting for you to give you life on the other side. And so he says, even under the law, your righteousness was not based on the works that you did, but the faith that you had that made you seek to do those works. It was always the faith that was important, the faith that mattered. Right? Does that make sense? So in your paper, you'll want to argue for a particular meaning of telos, having outlined, or listed the different possibilities. And to do that, you're going to need to show how it makes sense of the argument in context. Right? And again, it would be good to interact with the Hayes piece. Again, whether you agree or disagree, it'd be good to show your awareness and be able to interact with his argument.
And what's the two things differently to tell us how it works?
And then you want to show how it makes sense in context. Right? So one of the meanings you'll find for telos is that it can mean tax. And in fact, Paul uses it in that way elsewhere in Romans. But it's pretty clear it doesn't mean tax here. I mean, you don't have to spend a lot of time with that one. Christ is the tax of the law. Well, no, that doesn't work. That one you can eliminate immediately. But others of them, Hayes thinks it's fulfillment. There are other possibilities, many of which are encompassed by our word end. End is ambiguous, just like telos is in Greek. So end can mean end is actually a good translation of it in English because it leaves it ambiguous. But what you want to determine is what is the sense in the Greek. And again, to do that, you're going to want to show how it makes sense of Paul's argument in context. So remember, 10.4 is explaining what he said in 10.3. And 10.5 and following is explaining what he meant in 10.4. So you need to show how the meaning you choose enables this verse to explain what he said in 10.3 and to be explained by what he says in 10.5 and following.
I printed this one out, that's why I won't ask you for.
I already understand.
And Eric was saying, I was like, what is it Eric saying?
Yeah.
But I knew going through right here where it says to go towards number 3, from the beginning to say, to go toward which a movement is being directed at anyone goes out.
Okay, yeah, so that's one meaning of telos. That's possible. And so, you'll want to, examine the different possibilities and make an argument for why, you think the particular meaning you choose is the best one. Again, you want to interact with BDAG and with TD and T. Again, remember, those are secondary sources. So they're one scholar's, or in some cases more than one scholar's, opinion. They have reasons for that, and you can see the reasons. They'll often explain why they think it's one way or another. But ultimately, it's up to you to weigh the evidence and decide what you think.
So go to the library and get
Mhm. Look up telos. Yep, and again, you can look it up. Just find the T volume or the Tau volume, or you can go on blueletterbible.org, find 10.4, click on telos, and if you click on the Strong's number, it will tell you exactly what volume and page number to go look in the TD and T. So that's a shortcut to finding it if you want to do it that way. Mm-hmm. Okay. And again, when you're setting the context, you generally can go much faster and broader the further away you are. Okay, so Romans 1-8, you can just say, okay, here we're dealing with the Jewish side of the problem, and that's all. You don't have to get into an in-depth argument of what's going on in Romans 2, for example, unless it's germane to what you want to say he's arguing in Romans 10. But typically, so you can move, in broad chunks there. But as you get closer, then you get, smaller and more detailed because it's going to be more relevant to explaining what's going on in these verses. Does that make sense? And I would also say you don't have to come to the same conclusion I do. I've given you Hayes. I've explained what I think is going on. But what I'm looking for is not to see that you agree with me so much as that you can make an argument and defend the position that you're taking. Okay?
Okay. All right.
All right. Any other questions about the word study or about Romans 10?
You said 16 words.
Whatever it says in the syllabus. I don't remember off the top of my head.
I saw words.
And you have to cite.
You should cite any secondary sources that you're using. Again, I'll post an example of how to cite from BDAG and TD and T. TD and T will have different sections. So under telos, it'll have like use in the Greco-Roman world, use in the Old Testament, use in the Septuagint, use in the New Testament, use in. Sometimes the different sections will be written by different scholars. So, and then sometimes you'll have several words in a row that are all done by the same scholar, and his name won't appear until the very end. So if you want to know who's writing your section, and you need to know who's writing the part that you're citing, keep following until you see a name at the end of a section, whether it's the end of that section or the end of that word or the end of a couple words hence. And it'll usually just be a last name, which ideally, you would then go look up in the initial volume where it lists all the contributors and find the full name, or at least the initial, first initial and last name. Okay? Yes. Again, if you still have some outstanding tasks from previous weeks, that's okay. Don't let work on those keep you from finishing the word study, because the word study will have a late penalty if it's not in next week. Yeah, that's fine. So do the word study first, and then go back and continue working on old tasks if you still have some to finish up. You are not alone. You are not alone.
It makes you feel better.
Good, good.
Oh,
All right.